Hi there everyone, Steve the Amateur Historian here with you to discuss a cold case recently solved in the state of Oregon. It was solved just a little over a year ago, near the end of 2017, and I completely missed it, to be honest. I just discovered it recently, and it was a cold case that went almost 40 years before it was finally resolved. And the resolution to that cold case is a case in how sometimes you just need to get lucky to solve a cold case. Now I'm going to tell you before I start getting into the details, any murder case is a tragedy. Any murder case, any case of violence against anyone can be troubling, bothersome to anyone. I'm going to tell you, this goes deeper than just, this guy shot this guy. This is a very, very troubling, tragic story that I'm about to bring to you guys. So if you can't handle it, I totally understand. I'm just letting you know before I go in. Because in this video, I'm going to be talking about the 1979 murder of an 18-year-old girl named Janie Landers. The Amateur Historian. And before I get into the details of the case, what first gripped my attention to this was that Janie was a resident at the Fairview Training Center in Salem, Oregon. Now, the Fairview Training Center is one of the most troubling, disturbing stories in the history of Oregon, and the campus, which closed in 2000, has been a mecca for urbexers and people that just want to adventure and explore and see the remains of this place, which over the years has slowly, building by building, been getting torn down. I think there's little, if anything, still left standing there as of right now. But the Fairview Training Center was a large campus built to not just take care of, but essentially to take possession of and house people with various disabilities. And as I understand it, Janie Landers had pretty serious developmental deficiencies. Even at the age of 18, they said she was functioning at roughly the level of an 8-year-old. But she was still apparently very outgoing, and she knew how to protect herself the best she could, as I found out reading about this story. I had the pleasure or displeasure, there's kind of, it works in both cases, of visiting the Fairview Training Center one time a couple of years ago, and that particular visit is even more unnerving to me now. It was unnerving visiting there and just knowing the general history of the place, but I essentially took a series of photographs along the outside of the property and visited only one building there. And that was a building that when we visited, we didn't know what it was. But I later found out it was the laundry building on the campus where they did everybody's laundry. That's going to come back into play as this story unfolds. So, it's March 9th, 1979. And Janie Landers suddenly disappears. There's witnesses who say that they saw her talking to and leaving with a man that they didn't recognize. He was described as a stranger, driving a golden colored sedan, and she got into the car with this man. How that's even possible surprises me. This Fairview Training Center, one of the big things about this place is when they got a family to send over a loved one, their child, a relative, whatever, Fairview went to pretty strong lengths to pretty much take that person and disassociate them with the outside world. They would tell parents when they sent their children to Fairview, don't come and visit the kids. Just leave them to us. We will take care of them from now on. So it's very interesting that a place that serious about insulating its populace would just allow one of its inhabitants who's functioning, again, at like, second grade level, to just leave the property with someone. But that's apparently what happened, and Janie never returned. Her remains were found March 14th, 5 days later, abandoned on a path near Silver Falls State Park, which is about, they say it's about a 40-minute drive from roughly where Fairview Training Center is, so, something in the realm of 30, 40 miles away. And she'd had multiple deep stab wounds in her neck, but after her autopsy, it was found that her actual cause of death was blunt force trauma, specifically to the back of her head. And it was a tough case. It seems nobody knew who the man was that took her. Now, he was seen, so police sketches were done of this man that the police tried to use to, in any way possible, find some possible suspect in the crime. But it seems like Janie was probably murdered fairly close to when she was, you can say, abducted, even though it seems like she was probably manipulated into getting into this car. So it was an abduction, but it wasn't in the sense of someone grabbing someone and forcibly taking them. And it's unlikely. Some have tried to argue that he probably killed her near Silver Falls, very close to where she was abandoned, but there was pretty much no blood there. There was no physical evidence. There was really nothing to go on. It was obvious that Janie had tried to fight back. There was lots of, defensive wounds of her doing her best to try to fight off this guy, which, God bless her for doing everything she could to fight and to survive and to, in that moment where she was probably being overpowered. And the police had nothing to go on. They had no suspects, and the case went cold for decades, till 2015. Because Janie's family, no matter how much time had passed, they were constantly trying to get the police to keep working at this, keep trying, even though so much time had passed. And by 2015, the state police reopened the investigation 36 years after it had happened, and they put it in the hands of Detective Steve Hinkle, who worked in a major crimes department. And, this guy knew he had his work cut out for him. All these efforts to solve the crime in the past had been unsuccessful. What were the odds that he, working almost by himself, was going to resolve this crime? But he got into it. He pulled out all the old files, wanted to go through everything. He tried to coordinate them, so if anybody wanted to look at it in the future, presumably if he didn't get it figured out, hopefully other people down the line would continue to try. And the big break was, while looking at crime scene pictures, Hinkle was examining the stab wounds that Janie Landers had received, and he noticed the way that they were done. It appeared that whoever had attacked her had slipped. There weren't any markings on her from, like, pretty much the base of the handle of the knife, so it was almost like he was stabbing her but not quite making full contact. And it made him think, what if he, what if she was fighting back hard enough, and what if he did, hit her at a weird angle? And what he was thinking was, maybe in the scuffle he had actually cut himself, which in that moment, as he's presumably attacking her from above, kind of, or, going at her, however, If he cut himself, he would have left some of his DNA potentially on Janie. Now, that was the big break. The next effort was they went to the evidence locker and found the shirt that Janie had been wearing that had been in storage for, again, almost 40 years. And fortunately, they preserved it properly and the DNA was still usable. So they tested the DNA because there was all this, old dried blood on her shirt. And they found that some of the blood, the DNA in it, did not match Janie, which means it either matched her killer or by some crazy chance someone else stumbled onto her body and touched it and then left. Which, what are the odds of that? It was pretty certain that this was the killer's DNA. So of course the next step was to take that DNA and test it in the database and see if they have any matches. And lo and behold, they found a match with a guy named Gerald Dunlap, who was serving time, or had been serving time, in prison for the 1996 assault of a girl. So here's a guy who already has a track record of rape and abuse of younger women, vulnerable young women. And the fact that he was in prison or had gone into prison, that was how his DNA ended up in that database. So had the victim not come forward and had he not been tried and found guilty and put in prison, his DNA would not have been in that database, and they would have tested that unknown DNA on Janie Landers' shirt, and they wouldn't have found a match because the guy that didn't wouldn't have been in there. And unfortunately, by this time, Dunlap had passed away. He actually died in 2002 while in prison, so he never was, I guess, physically brought to justice for what he did, but the case was finally closed in that they knew he was the one who did it. So even though he's long gone, they don't have to worry about interviewing him or doing further testing or anything like that. And when you look at Dunlap, it is a horribly tragic thing. And unfortunately, totally representative of what the Fairview Training Center was. They tried to present themselves as this great cutting-edge hospital that took in all these, struggling disabled people and did their utmost to give them a purpose, to take care of them, to try to educate them and give them things to do and so on, when the reality is so much darker. This is a place where, these people that were suffering horrible disabilities were mistreated on a daily basis. I remember hearing a story about someone who, when they were young there, the people who worked there would stick them in like a burlap bag and like close it up and make them struggle to breathe, I guess to prove a point or something. So this was a horrible, dysfunctional place. And when I say dysfunctional, I'm not talking about the patients. I'm talking about the people that ran it. And here's this Dunlap guy who gets a job working there. And he gets a job working laundry. He was working in that laundry building, the one building there that I've actually visited. And that's where Gerald Dunlap worked while he was at the Fairview Training Center. And, they hired him. They didn't do much of a background check on him because this guy was convicted of rape in Tennessee back in 1961 and given a 99-year sentence, of which he was paroled after 12 years. So 1973, he's back out on the street. Obviously, that didn't turn up because why in God's name would a place that is full of young, developmentally disabled people, why would you hire somebody with a history of rape to their record? Why would you even consider that person's application? And yet they hired him because they didn't do a good enough job looking him over. And they would end up firing him in 1983, specifically because of behavior he was engaging in that they deemed inappropriate with female members of staff and patients. You'd think that alone would put Gerald Dunlap on the police's radar in terms of this case that at this point was 4 years old. This girl's missing, and here is a guy that worked there, and it was verified. He didn't only work at Fairview Training Center while Janie Landers was there. He was working there on the day she disappeared. And he has a record of rape and assault, a prison record, and he wasn't even interviewed, wasn't even talked to, wasn't even for 5 seconds, as far as we can see, considered as even a person of interest, much less a suspect. And, you know, they look back in the past, you know, they say he drove, the witnesses who saw the stranger, who was Dunlap, taking Janie Landers and putting him into his car. They said it was a golden sedan. When Dunlap's wife was interviewed, you know, after he was determined to be the killer, she said he had a car just like that. And there was another person who worked at the Fairview Training Center who said that Dunlap drove a sedan like that and that he was seen multiple times offering rides to people, including patients, at the Fairview Training Center. Again, how was this guy not looked into? And, you know, once he was determined to be the guy, you know, they took a mugshot of him. The closest picture they could really get of this guy to being around 1979 when this murder happened was a mugshot of him in 1973, right before he was released from Tennessee prison. So this is only 6 years before. So essentially, he's going to look pretty much like he looked in 1979. And authorities took that picture of him and matched it with the police sketches that were taken based on witness accounts of this guy that put Janie Landers into his car. And it's astonishing how close they match. From the hairline down to the mouth, it's so completely similar. And you'd think, you know, one of the first things you'd think is they have a sketch, they have some witnesses of someone taking her from right by the hospital and leaving with her, because obviously Fairview didn't care about actually protecting the people that were there, so they just let this woman leave with somebody. I mean, it can almost kind of make sense that they would be more laxed if a guy who worked there, who'd offered people rides before, took her. But that only applies if they knew in that moment that the guy that was actually taking her was Gerald Dunlap. And even at the time when she was taken, the witnesses didn't know who he was. But the witnesses had to be people that probably worked at Fairview or were possibly patients. So you'd think they would have at least seen this guy a couple of times, or at least said, I don't know who he is, but I'm pretty sure I've seen him once or twice. It's all very, very, very wild and horribly troubling that there was all this writing on the wall that said Dunlap should have been looked into right away. He even was known to frequently hike over by Silver Falls. It was like one of his favorite places to go to when he wasn't at work. And that's where the body of Janie Landers is found. It's astonishing. It's, you know, for what it's worth, it's wonderful that all these years later, the mystery is finally solved. Her family can take whatever closure you can get from that, from finally knowing after almost 40 years. I can't imagine what that must feel like. But the fact of the matter is, with how many clues there were, with how obvious this was, this Gerald Dunlap guy should have come under the radar a long, long time ago. So it's a very troubling story, and yet it's such a perfect representation of how dysfunctional and screwed up and seedy and sketchy and whatever other synonyms for messed up you want to come up with when describing the Fairview Training Center. This is just all-inclusive on it and how bad that place was. A blight on Oregon's history. And that is the story of the murder of 18-year-old Janie Landers. I hate going from something that sad, it's a story worth telling, but going from something that traumatic and sad to then transition into, remember to like, comment, and subscribe on my stuff. I can't even do it for this one. I'm just going to say, take care of yourself, take care of your family. You see something screwy, say something. You know, we all need to look out for one another. And anyway, till next time, guys, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian.